The church gave Mr. Brontë one of the most desolate parishes in England, Haworth in Yorkshire, in the far isolation of the northern moors. The parsonage was surrounded on three sides by the graves of the dead parishioners, a true ghastly neighborhood for a young family. Not long after taking up his duties in Haworth, Bronte's wife died and left him a widower with 6 children aged 7, 6, 4, 2, 1, and an infant. His first task was to find a caretaker for the family, and he called upon his dead wife's sister, Elizabeth Branwell, who lived in Penzance. She gave up her comfortable life there and came to serve as housekeeper and substitute mother. Patrick Brontë was an eccentric and exacting father, but his children took full advantage of his passions, a wonderful library. The 4 children could be found reading books from the earliest age. Now, you notice I said 4 children, even though there had been 6 in the family, but they didn't remain 6 for long, because the 2 oldest girls, Maria and Elizabeth, were sent off to a boarding school. Of course, Mr. Brontë had little money to spare on education, but there were schools back then specifically for poor rector's children. These schools were inexpensive. They were also nightmarish. The 2 Brontë girls were sent to Cowan Bridge School and suffered there under appalling conditions, eventually being taken home ill. Their release from this cold, hunger, and disease of Cowan Bridge came too late. Both girls died within 5 weeks of each other. At the ages of 11 and 10, Charlotte and Emily lost their 2 beloved older sisters. For a detailed portrait of Cowan School, read the early chapters of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Jane is sent to a school called Lowood, run by the villain Mr. Brocklehurst. According to Charlotte Brontë, Lowood's brutal conditions are an exact replica of those that killed her sisters. One day, Mr. Brontë came home from a journey and brought the 4 remaining Brontë children some beautiful wooden painted soldiers. He gave them to Branwell, who shared them with his sisters. Now, had these been normal children, they would likely have used the toy soldiers to play at war. Instead, they went to the parlor, put the soldiers on the floor in various positions, and then pretended these soldiers were creatures from 2 fantasy kingdoms. The 4 Brontë children divided themselves into 2 riding groups, Branwell and Charlotte in one, and Emily and Anne in the other. Emily and Anne created a world called Gondal. It was a science fiction-y world where the rivers ran with milk and honey and all trees looked like strange triangles. It was a beautiful, exotic world, very strange, peopled by the toy soldiers. Charlotte and Branwell entered a very different world, Angria. This fantasy world was, as it sounds, like a pulsing, almost vicious world where the rivers ran red and a constant, strong beat was underneath. They wrote minutely detailed adventure stories of the soldiers who populated Angria. For over 10 years, these 4 children expanded the 2 worlds through their stories. But they didn't just write stories, they actually wrote books. Once an adventure story had been completed, the children would print the stories on little pieces of paper. They made sure the margins were even, right, and left, just as in a printed novel. And when they finished the little book, they looked like a tiny novel. Of course, they needed a cover for their book, so they would raid the kitchen. Sugar came in blue cardboard boxes. They would pour the sugar into an earthen vessel, then cut the stiff blue cardboard to make a perfect cover. They would put the title on the cover with their names. They would use a little paste to glue it on, and presto, a tiny volume smaller than their palms. But they didn't compile just 10 or 50 of these stories. They wrote hundreds over the years. This was their training as children for their future novelists that at least 3 of them would become. Mr. Brontë was not much impressed with his children were writing these vivid adventures. His concern was with who would earn the much-needed income once they left school. Charlotte was the eldest. The responsibility fell upon her. When she graduated from school, she began to seek employment. Charlotte was extremely bright, but she came from a poor rector's family. If a woman at that time was bright and yet poor, only one position was readily available. If you've read Jane Eyre, you know what Charlotte became, a governess. I don't think we appreciate today the position of governess and what it was like in the Victorian period. Thanks to Masterpiece Theatre, we have a romantic notion of a beautiful young girl employed in a wealthy home tutoring darling little children. Charlotte tells us the reality, that being a governess was hell on earth. It was a wretched position. Darling, well-behaved children were rare. Truly wealthy people didn't have a governess tutor their children. They sent their children to expensive boarding schools. Boarding school was a mark of status, a way to cement societal connections as well as educational experience. If, however, the parents had a lot of money but had children who were such intellectual or emotional nightmares that no school could ever accept them, a governess was the solution. Occasionally one could find a good child, but only because the child was illegitimate, as Adele was in Jane Eyre, and therefore not eligible for a good boarding school. The other problem the governess faced, probably a worse ordeal than not having decent students, was that the family would have nothing to do with her because she was considered too low in class to be a part of society. The governess actually worked for a living, and the family that hired her would have thought she was below their regard. But there was an upstairs and a downstairs in the family. Downstairs were the servants, the butler, the cook, the housekeeper, and the maids. They certainly wouldn't have found the governess too low to associate with. She was too high. Servants resented that all she did was tutor some brats for a few hours a day and thus earned 3 times what the kitchen maid earned by scrubbing pots. Family had nothing to do with the governess because she was too low. The servants had nothing to do with her because she was too high. It was a most painful, alienating position unless the governess was beautiful. If you examine some of the family portraits that were painted of wealthy Victorian families, you will see in many portraits a rather ugly father, a plain mother, and 3 unattractive children. The 6th figure will be a beautiful and delightful young woman. You might think, well, at least they had one attractive child. They didn't. That's the governess. The upstairs family enjoyed having the beautiful governess because she was so attractive. And the servants, the downstairs family, prized having a beautiful governess around because by just eating at the humble table of the servants, this beautiful girl put everyone in a better mood. But Charlotte Brontë was not beautiful. She was not even plain. A young man who saw her at a party wrote to his fiancée that night, "I met Miss Brontë tonight, and I would have to say she would have to be twice as good looking as she actually is to be considered homely." Charlotte Brontë was ugly. Don't be fooled by the somewhat attractive picture I've included. Victorian portraits were notoriously flattering. She was about 4'10", tiny with a reddish complexion. We do not emphasize her ugliness in an individuous sense. I tell you she is ugly as a great compliment to Charlotte Brontë because she was so unattractive when she would later invent her immortal heroine Jane Eyre, created in her own image. She did something for Jane that no other author had done for a heroine. We know Jane is unattractive before we even open the novel. Why? The name of the novel is Jane Eyre. This was revolutionary at the time. No one had ever named a heroine Jane before. The name Jane always implied plain Jane. Consider the names of the heroines of earlier novels: Clarissa, Evelina, Pamela. Just from the name Jane, readers knew she was going to be unattractive. And in the novel itself, we are not left in doubt as to what Jane looked like. Her lover, Mr. Rochester, at one point says, "Though the world considers you ugly, I see beneath that facade." This is hardly what a young lady wants to hear from her beau in courtship. Charlotte Brontë has given us the first realistic heroine in English literature. As one critic wrote, Jane Eyre is the story of an ugly duckling who grows up to be an ugly duck. There is no swan in Jane Eyre, nor was there meant to be. Charlotte was unattractive and sullen, and therefore temperamentally unsuited to be a governess. She had no success as one, and she returned home. We turn now to the second daughter, Emily. Was Emily unattractive? No, she was very attractive. She was 5'7", tall for a young woman back then. She held herself regally and had a fine figure and an attractive face. How did she turn and fare on the governess market? We will never know because Emily was so eccentric in personality that she was never considered a governess material. Emily's problem was mental, not physical. She was excessively shy and withdrawn. We learned from Charlotte that when Emily was a teenager, she would spend 5 or 6 hours in her bedroom simply standing at the window and gazing out. That would be strange enough, but while she gazed, the white window blind was closed. She wasn't looking at the view of the moors. She was spending hours looking at simply this white window blind. Charlotte noted that if you passed close enough to Emily, you would see her mouth moving and you could hear her talking. She was inventing future characters for her gondole stories, projecting those characters on the white screen as we project characters onto a motion picture screen today. She was watching her creations and making up their dialogue. We come to 1846, a troublesome year for the Brontë family on Haworth. All 3 daughters were once again at home, unemployed, yet Charlotte, who should have been terribly depressed by the situation, was not. Her enthusiasm and initiative prompted her to a new idea. She and her sisters should put their storytelling gifts to use by writing novels. Bramwell had yet to decide upon his life's focus, but did not want to participate in this idea. What Charlotte proposed in early 1847 was that during the day, all 3 of them would write their separate novels. At night, each of them would read aloud the passages they had written, so the other 2 could critique them. In a short time, she felt each sister should have a work of her own, and they would have 3 separate novels to send off to publishers.